So we're to our non-current assets, and we'll start with our long-term investments. So if you remember from our current assets, we had temporary investments or short-term investments, and we had the categories trading, available for sale, and held for maturity that we talked about. In your long-term investment section, you're not going to see the trading securities because those are by definition short-term. But you can see some of the available for sale and some of the held for maturity securities if management's intention and they have the ability to hold them for the long term. Okay, so that would be investments in bonds, debt investments, investments in stock investments, or equity investments. And those, so those are your investments in securities that can end up in the long-term investments section. You can also have the another type of investment in securities, and this is, if you remember, companies where this company bought enough of the other company so that they have significant influence, but they don't have enough to file consolidated financial statements. So they have significant influence, but not control. And these investments are accounted for using the equity method. So you could have investments in non-consolidated, we don't have enough ownership to consolidate them, but non-consolidated subsidiaries or affiliated companies. So those also end up in your long-term investment section. Other things that can end up there would be investments in fixed tangible assets. This could be land that we're holding for speculation. It could be equipment that the company is planning to sell. Things that are not used in the operations of the company, but we're planning to sell them. And then there's investments that are set aside for specific purposes. So these would be various funds, usually. A plant expansion fund, cash surrender value of life insurance, funds that we're setting aside to pay a future bond issue that's coming due, pension funds, things like that. They're really earmarked for some specific use. Okay, so that's your basic long-term investments. Property, plant, and equipment has to be used in the operations of the company. They're often the primary revenue generating assets. So this is your buildings, furniture, equipment, things that you are familiar with, plus the timber tracts, the land improvements, natural resources, oil wells, various things like that. And so a lot of times they'll be reported at a single amount, but there has to be the supporting schedules. For your homework, I like to see buildings less the accumulated depreciation that goes with it, natural resources less the accumulated depletion that goes with that, just so that you're clear on that we know what we're doing here. But in the real world, sometimes it would be reported as a reported the cost less the accumulated depreciation or the accumulated depletion, and then there would be significant schedules showing how that number was arrived at. You have to disclose any liens. If anybody has any claims against these, that has to be disclosed. Okay, intangibles. These are our patents and copyrights, goodwill, all that good stuff. And no physical substance, but used in the operations of the company. If they have a limited life, we'll be amortizing them over the useful life, and they'll be reported at their cost net of accumulated amortization. If they are indefinite life intangibles, since you cannot divide by infinity, we do not amortize them because you can't do it mathematically. And so those with unlimited lives are evaluated annually to see if they have lost their value. So they test annually for impairment. Okay, other assets basically is a catch-all for things that are not material enough or just don't fit well anywhere else. So you could have some long-term prepaid expenses, deferred income taxes, there's various other things. And so it basically should only be used for items that don't fit anywhere else. one thing to keep in mind as you're classifying is the overall purpose. You want to you have to keep in mind with this, the classifications, they have these classifications for a reason. When you're looking at something, if it's property, plant, and equipment, that by definition, we're using that in the operations. Other and intangible assets, we're using those in the operations. These two, they're not directly related. The long-term investments and other assets, not directly related to the operations. So you can have the same piece of land, and if it's used in our current operations, it would be property, plant, and equipment. If it were just idle land, maybe held for speculation, it could be an investment. If it was kind of idle land we just didn't know what to do with, we might just classify it as an other asset. So there's a lot of thought that goes into how to classify all these different items. Okay, so that wraps up our assets. We'll move on to liabilities.